Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're going to start with the event proceedings. My name is Ramon Pacheco Pardo, and I hold the KFBUB Korea chair. Thank you very much for all of you for coming to this, the inaugural Brussels Korea Forum, which we hope to make an annual event. I'm going to make a short introduction, followed by the director of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, Dr. Luis Simon, and then we will go straight to the first session. I'm going to start with an announcement regarding mask wearing. As you can see, I'm not wearing a mask. We've been told it's optional because everyone is being scanned as they come in. So it's up to you whether you want to wear a mask or not, and I was told to make this announcement, so it is optional. And a very brief introduction about the forum today. We had the idea about holding this forum already a couple of years ago. So before the pandemic started, we wanted to hold this forum with guests coming from Korea and from different European countries. Then the pandemic hit. And this spring we thought, okay, we'll try to organize it physical, as is happening in the end. And if it can happen, it will happen. If it cannot happen, we'll postpone it for another year. Thankfully, we're able to organize it. Thankfully, the speakers from Korea were able to come without much disturbance. So thank you very much for joining us from Seoul, and thank you everyone for joining us from different European countries. The forum itself, as you can see in the program, is going to focus essentially on security, politics, and economics from a European perspective and obviously from a Korean perspective. The idea is to have an open discussion about Korean Peninsula affairs throughout the day today. And it only rests me to thank the Korea Foundation for sponsoring this event, the Korean Cultural Center in Brussels for providing support, and also to my staff, led by Paula, who has been organizing all the logistics for this event. And now I will let my director to go ahead and also introduce the center as well. Luis, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ramon, and good morning, everyone. I'm Luis Simon, Director of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, CSDS, at the Brussels School of Governance. So just a quick hello from my side before moving on to our opening panel. I hope those of you who were here present this morning enjoyed some of the discussions. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. We're particularly grateful to those of you who made it from Korea. It's been a while since we last had a physical event of this magnitude, and we're particularly happy to start off with the first real edition of the forum, of the Brussels Korea Forum, which I think is in excellent shape, as we can see, to become the referent forum in Brussels and Europe for all things Korea. So congratulations to Ramon and to his Korea chair team, and especially to Paula, of course, for putting together such an outstanding program and such a smooth organization. And of course, again, like Ramon said, to the Korea Foundation and Korean Cultural Center for supporting the forum, and to KF for its ongoing support of our Korea chair and partnership throughout the last few years. As you know, the KF-VUB chair that Ramon leads is one of our flagship initiatives at CSDS and at the school and at the VUB more broadly. And this forum, I think, bears witness to its importance and its success. The timing, of course, to hold this forum here in Brussels could hardly be any better. As many of you know, the European Union is paying more and more attention to the Indo-Pacific, and we've seen that with several strategies issued this year. And of course, the ROK, as many of you also know, is a go-to partner and a referent for the European Union in the region. I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to talk about that and unpack that and its security and economic dimensions, particularly in the second and third panels. So looking forward to those discussions. And last but not least, of course, thanks to the Korean Embassy and Ambassador Yoon for their support to all of our activities. I think that's it from my side. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the forum. Thank you. And now the panelists, I guess you can... All right, so we're going to get started right away with our first panel. As you know, the title is Korean Peninsula Security. We're going, of course, this is a very broad theme, as you know. We're going to address two sets of security challenges, everything that has to do with inter-Korean relations, and secondly, and of course, are very much related, the Korean Peninsula's place in the broader process of Sino-American competition in the region. Of course, the question of inter-Korean relations relates to the DPRK's rapidly developing nuclear and missile programs, to its deterrence and arms control aspects, but also to the broader political relationship and the broader process between the two Koreas. I'd also like us to touch a little bit on the ROK's defense strategy and the future of the U.S.-ROK alliance, and perhaps also on the ROK's evolving relationship with Japan as it relates to the security domain. As you know, there's been a lot of discussion in recent months and years about the DPRK's advances in so-called tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons, but also in terms of the DPRK being able to place multiple warheads on a single ICBM, which would make it easier to elude U.S. ballistic missile defenses. A key objective, it seems, would be to sort of provoke a decoupling, you are all surely acquainted with this concept, between the U.S. and the ROK. And there's been a lot of debate in South Korea about possible responses that could include giving the ROK a stronger role in nuclear deterrence, either through greater consultation with the United States or even nuclear sharing, a la NATO, or some version of it. And some people have even argued openly for a nuclear weapon capability for South Korea. And in any case, this is, of course, tied to the broader discussion on the future of the U.S.-ROK alliance and the U.S. Conventional footprint and missile posture in the peninsula and in the region, and particularly in the immediate vicinity of the peninsula. Just a couple of words from my side on the broader question of the peninsula's place in Sino-American competition. We are, of course, seeing China's military modernization proceed apace, and many analysts speak of an impending imbalance in critical scenarios such as a Taiwan Strait contingency. In the meantime, there are growing concerns about China's own internal direction as Beijing sort of ramps up political and economic pressure at home. And the Biden administration, for its part, seems to be doubling down on the whole concept of competition with China, and arguably made some headway this year in terms of gathering support for U.S. objectives with the strengthening of the Quad, AUKUS, the strengthening of the U.S.-ROK alliance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Of course, we assume that the DPRK is very close to the PRC, which it is. At the same time, the previous U.S. President Trump seemed to sense some sort of opportunity to do some wedging between the PRC and the DPRK. At least that was his logic, hoping to leverage the DPRK's interest in reducing its dependence from China. Meanwhile, the ROK has tried traditionally to downplay tensions and continues to insist that the U.S.-ROK alliance, although there may have been some movement on that front recently, but that the U.S.-ROK alliance is primarily about the DPRK and not a front in Sino-American competition, at least as it relates to security aspects. And it also has a very substantial, as you know, economic relationship with Beijing, and also a significant diplomatic and political relationship with Beijing, which is an important player in peninsula-related stuff. However, the growing polarization between the U.S. and China raises questions about the sustainability of the ROK's foreign policy strategy. I think to address all these questions and all these puzzles, we could hardly speak for hope for a better lineup. We have Ambassador Kim Won-soo, who is chair of the International Advisory Board at the Future Consensus Institute, and he's also former UN Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Great to have you with us, Ambassador. We have also Ambassador Kim Chang-beom, who's an advisor with the Center for Strategic and Cultural Studies, CSCS. He's had a long and distinguished diplomatic career as well in the ROK, and was, of course, more importantly for us, Korea's ambassador to the European Union and to the Kingdom of Belgium between 2012 and 2015. Ambassador, great to have you in Brussels again. Then we have Kim Saime, who is a KF in the Pacific Program Visiting Fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute in London, and a PhD student at King's College, London. Great to have you with us. And of course, our very own Korea chair, Ramon Pacheco, whom you all know already and whom you've met already today. So I would like to start with Ambassador Kim Won-soo. Ambassador, you've written that the recent US ROK summit looked very much like the US was moving closer to the ROK position on the DPRK, and that the ROK was moving closer to the US position on China. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this point and tell us a bit what are the key challenges for the US ROK alliance going forward in light of the DPRK's advances in nuclear and missile capabilities, and also in light of growing Sino-American competition. So the two aspects. Of course, also it would also be great if you could tell us a bit about how much and in what ways these questions matter in the context of next year's presidential election. And last but not least, in light of your experience in the area, what do you think about the prospects for disarmament on the peninsula? Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luis, for your kind introduction. And also I must thank Ramon for taking the initiative to invite all of us. I think for most of us, this is our first adventure we are making out of the pandemic. And also, I'm very grateful to participants who came all the way from Korea and outside of Brussels, but also audience in Brussels for joining us today. And I'm the first Kim of the three Kims sitting at this panel. And you will see more Kims later on. But before answering the question Luis just put forward to me, I want to take a step back, because I want to give a background where we stand on Korean Peninsula security issues. Because I wish, anybody can provide a magic solution on this problem, but we have tried for over the last 70 years and also 30 years on nuclear issues, but still, even we cannot agree where we stand. Some may say we are in not a bad shape, but others may say we are in a bad shape. So depending on how you want to see it, even the assessment of where we stand now is divided. So we are doing far worse than even weather forecasters. Weather forecasters can at least agree on whether it is rainy, cloudy, or sunny right now. But we cannot agree. That means that the challenges we are facing are so many and complex. And also, we have gone through cycles of stalemate, rising tensions, and suddenly then rapprochement, dialogue, and then back to stalemate, or sometimes back to a crisis again. So we need long-term perspective, but also we have to understand what are the challenges involved. And to simplify the picture, I like to use an analogy, because when we look at peace and security challenges on the Korean Peninsula, I always think of it could be like heavy loaded cart, which have two wheels. One wheel is peace, the other wheel denuclearization. And also, this cart is carried or pulled by 6 different horses. 2 Koreas, US, China, Japan, Russia. Different in sizes and different priorities and different agenda. And each of peace and denuclearization agenda is complicated. Even just, I talk about disarmament challenges we have. I can tell you that even if we have a deal on denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, it'll require a lot of heavy lifting. And also, we don't know what will happen down the path of implementation, because we are now dealing with the most difficult case for denuclearizing North Korean nuclear and missile capabilities in the history of disarmament. And also, the sanctions put on North Korea in response to the continuous development and sophistication of North Korea is also very extensive. So sanctions regime also most expensive in the history of UN Security Council. So denuclearization challenges is enormous, but also peace agenda. We have to move from now to durable peace. That means that we have to solve all outstanding problems, covering all aspects of our life on the Korean Peninsula: political, economic, and military. So if we multiply 6 different priorities, 6 different agenda by 6 different horses, multiply by 2 wheels, and also multiplied by 3 domains, it is really complex equation. And each horse has different priorities. Maybe one horse wants to move only on peace wheel, stopping denuclearization wheel. Maybe the other players have opposite priority. But that means then the cart cannot make forward movement, because one wheel doesn't move, the other wheel keeps moving. Either it will make circles or it may collapse. So it is very difficult exercise. But now we can say that we have 2 consensus. That's, I think, good news. One consensus is that every player, including the horses, agree on the destination point, which is durable peace and complete denuclearization. Although there is a huge vacuum on how we move from now and here to our destination point. Huge vacuum. And second consensus we have is we have to make sure if this cart doesn't make forward movement, then we have to make sure it doesn't collapse. Because then it will be a disaster coming to the whole Korean Peninsula. So that's the background. And now coming to the challenges of what we should do now. So we have to make sure that the priorities of 6 different horses should be coordinated. Otherwise, the movement of the cart will be, maybe some horse may want to pull the cart this way or others in the opposite direction. And also the way each of these 6 players are trying to interact with the others also complicate the problem, starting from U.S.-China, Sino-U.S. relationship, because those are the two largest horses. And also, smallest but wildest horse is, of course, North Korea. And it is extremely difficult to predict what North Korea plans to do or what are their priorities at each stage of the path ahead. Because when it comes to reading North Korean mind, I always reminded of the metaphor Winston Churchill used on former Soviet Union. It's like a three-level puzzle inside an enigma, puzzle inside an enigma, wrapped by mystery. It means it's extremely difficult to decipher how the decision is made by the system and also by its decision-making core and leadership. So without real understanding, without any functionable human intelligence, it is extremely difficult to predict what North Korea's priorities are. So that now brings to what South Korea can do, and also in the context of the coming presidential election. We had a warm-up discussion before this event, and there I think two consensus are coming up again. How to reach from here and now to the destination point, still negotiated settlement, but backed by strong deterrence, should be the preferred way forward. And second, South Korea, although we are not the biggest player, biggest horse, but still South Korea has a role to play, particularly in steadying the movement of this cart. Yeah, so it should be kind of anchor horse to provide sense of direction toward desired endpoint. And that requires a roadmap with a detailed plan of action for implementation. And whoever wins next presidential election in South Korea, I hope, and again, this is a very strong, I think, a consensual view from our earlier discussion that the next president, should devise a draft roadmap with a plan of action and put it to a national process so that that plan will enjoy strong bipartisan support from Korea. Because if South Korean horse is divided and without a clear sense of direction, it will create confusion to all other five horses. So we need a very credible internal process to come up with a plan with long-term perspective and a clear roadmap. And then we have to devise a concerted U.S.-South Korea alliance strategy with a clear division of role. Because we all know that although it should be two Koreas in the front row of in front of the cart, but on many issues, North Korea wants to talk to the U.S., and also on issues related to peace, China also wants to jump in. So we have to make clear with the right sequence of policy coordination with the US, and then trilateral coordination with Japan, and then through consultation with China and Russia, we have to get at least understanding from all other four courses toward our desired endpoint. So that's the analogy I want to give. Now coming back to your question on the U.S. recent outcome of U.S.-South Korea communique, because that communique to me is quite significant because it contains the mutual understanding of South Korea's priority on North Korea policy, but also U.S. policy on China, particularly in East and South China Seas. Because that communique contains, I think for the first time, reference to the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits, and also it refers to Indo-Pacific, and so that's, I think, opening the door for South Korea also with regard to Quad Plus, and I think that is important to have the mutual confidence between U.S. and South Korea on the future direction of any security and peace policies in and around Korean Peninsula into the future. So that's why I put those two things on the spot. And the U.S. strategy on China, I mean, there, I think also we are very much on the same boat with our European partners. Because like Europe, we don't see the U.S.-China relationship to further slide to competition, then maybe even confrontational competition, and also then maybe even unintended conflict, escalation. So we share the same interest to prevent that scenario from coming true. So that's why I think we should be more creative and imaginative. So in that respect, back to the cart analogy, I think if we add EU as maybe seventh horse to help South Korea to steady the cart, and also we may be creative in adding a smaller, maybe front wheel in front of these peace and denuclearization wheels called confidence building measures. And I think Europe can help South Korea and other parties to the six-party process if and when that process is to be resumed in the future. So I think there will be a lot of room for Europe and South Korea to work together to ease the tension, not only in and around the Korean Peninsula, but in the wider East Asia and Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you. Terrific, Ambassador. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to all of these questions about carts and horses and wheels. and I'd love to unpack a bit more that sort of quid pro quo that you alluded to, US ROK, later on, if there's time. Ramon has written recently about the Quad Plus, so hopefully you can come in on that later. But let's now move on to Chang-byung. I was wondering if you could perhaps zoom in on the evolving debate within the ROK on how to deal with the rapidly evolving DPRK threat, especially as we head towards an election year. It'd be great if you could share some thoughts on that. Good to have you here, Ambassador.
Thank you, Luis. I'm very glad to be back to Brussels after more than 6 years. I left Brussels in the spring of 2015 after completing my diplomatic assignment as a Korean ambassador to the European Union and Belgium in 2015. So, well, this quite a nostalgic journey and sentimental reunion with old friends and this EU officials whom I have been working together with for a long time. I'm particularly thankful for Luis and Ramon to organize this auspicious event in the middle of this still ongoing pandemic here in Brussels. This Ambassador Kim, there are so many Kims, so I think this Changbom is my first name, so I think it's better to be referred as Changbom. Well, Ambassador Kim has touched upon quite extensive landscape that we are now living in and also faced with, especially from the geopolitical and geostrategic perspective. And I'm, as was suggested by Luis, I'm going to dive in some detailed kind of the elements or the milestones that we could consider when we are looking at the general landscape on the Korean Peninsula. The first one is I guess it's about 4 elements that we could dwell on. One is a series of tests that have been made by North Korea in the recent months, especially last month. And the second element is the presidential election that have been discussed in the previous session. Is a private warm-up session in the morning that will be taking place on the 9th of March next year, and then we will witness the change of leadership in Seoul in May. And the third element is that kind of worries and concerns now being stirred up in Northeast Asia about potential rise of arms race. It's particularly exacerbated by the series and continuous development of nuclear weapons and missile programs by North Korea, but still it's corresponding measures by South Korea and others within the region. And the fourth point that would be relevant in our kind of the observation would be how this U.S.-China relations will be affecting the equation, especially with regard to the Korean Peninsula and also denuclearization process, as was mentioned by Ambassador Kim. North Korea has tested quite a number of set of missiles last month that have been a bit of unusual breakout of a bit of calm period for the last 6 months in the first half of this year. And that might be a signal or again the pressure from North Korea to remind the Biden administration, which is not new yet, no longer, that North Korea's kind of the passion or desire or the continuous pursuit of nuclear weapon state is demanding White House direct attention. But North Korean side has not directly crossed the so-called red line that's tried to be a bit of soft and smart enough in a calculated move to test some short-range and cruise missiles and one ballistic missiles. So that is a kind of the measured gesture from North Korea to both kind of induce the direct intervention and the attention from the White House, but at the same time to refrain themselves from going for any harder provocations that would, of course, induce retaliatory measures or the further strengthen of sanction enforcement. So North Korea's this type of saber rattling or the kind of the tension elevation still not in full swing, a bit subdued mode, but crisis is brewing as we are approaching the presidential election in Korea in March next year, and also the continued low priority imposed upon North Korean issue by the U.S. administration. So we'll have to see whether this type of subdued, a bit of calculated approach will remain as it is, or the North Korea will be losing its patience and to embark on much harder and kind of aggressive provocations to test the will of both South Korea and U.S. leadership. So one important element that we are now looking at this the missile test is that North Korea is now testing new types of regional missiles. I mean, missiles aimed at targeted at regional targets that can strike targets in Korea and Japan with increasing accuracy and more reliability. That is quite worrisome because in the past, the interballistic missile tests have been more or less targeted at U.S. mainland, but nowadays it is giving extra burden and extra worries on the Korean, South Korean defense policymakers, because it is now giving extra burdens and the risk for South Korea to maintain so-called anti-missile defense system. South Korea has been developing its own Korean version of Iron Dome. It's an Israeli Iron Dome system, and also it's developing kill chain to counter the missile threats from North Korea. But this type of new so-called supersonic or the long-range cruise missiles and also submarine-launched ballistic missile test are giving extra burdens and also further kind of second thoughts on how to counter this new emerging region-targeted missiles from the perspective of South Korean defense policymakers. And then let me move on to the presidential election. Well, there's as was mentioned by the Ambassador Kim earlier, that the Korean society is more or less divided, and especially when it comes to this election season, the conservative candidates, mainly from PPP, People's Power Party, kind of pro-US and try to steer away from pro-China policy that has been reported to be center of foreign policy agenda is driven by the current administration. And then the Progressive Party candidate, which is ruling party, the Third Democratic Party, that's Governor Lee Jae-myung from Gyeonggi Province. He is more or less inheriting the policy taken by President Moon Jae-in for the last 5 years. And one kind of the anecdote that I could share with you, that when he was interviewed by CCTV, the Chinese national TV station in 2017 about THAAD, this theater high altitude missile defense system to be introduced into Korea by the United States. And he was strongly opposed to the introduction of THAAD into Korea. So that is, well, of course, it's 4 years ago. So so at that time he was regarded as pro-China when he was appearing on CCTV. So relatively speaking, I think there are quite a deep divide between the two political camps, progressive and conservative party candidates camp. But even though we are now witnessing this kind of the deepening divide, but still I think there's all in all, the threat perception on North Korea remains high as it used to be. And of course, there's some, according to some poll surveys, especially amongst the younger generation, I mean the 20s, the threat perception vis-a-vis North Korea is getting a bit lower than the elderly generation. And one interesting phenomenon or the feature that we are now witnessing is that even though in general this elderly or elder generation are more conservative than the younger ones, but in case of the perception toward unification or the coexistence with North Korea, the younger generation, especially respondents of the age of 20s, they are more conservative. They are more preferring to have peaceful coexistence with North Korea rather than to have eventual unification as one single state. And also the younger generations are much more preferring to have kind of the value-driven approach. So interestingly enough, there's the favorability poll results on North Korea is more or less remaining same. It's very low, but interesting phenomenon is that anti-China disapproval rate or the unfavorable list vis-a-vis China is getting higher and higher. So in some poll outcomes, even the favorability rating is much lower in case of China than even in case of North Korea. So the kind of anti-China perception or the sentiments are quite getting full steam within younger generation in Korea. I think that's more based upon value-based kind of the approach. And the U.S.-China kind of the conflicts or rift between the two major powers, I think that is affecting less and the less frequent and less solid and less strategic dialogue and consultation between U.S. and China on the security and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. So we are now weakening the coordination and sometimes almost absence of coordination between the United States and China on this specific topic. So I think that's gradually we are now looking at kind of the divide and grouping amongst the major countries, major stakeholders vis-a-vis North Korean issue, the resolution of North Korean case. So kind of the North Korea, China, Russia group vis-a-vis South Korea, US, and Japan. Of course, that we do have some limitation in the maintenance of trilateral collaboration and consultation among US, China, US, Korea, and Japan on this specific security issue. But still, I think that's the regrouping is now emerging vis-a-vis this North Korean case. So I think that's due to a time constraint. I will stop here, then I'll be responding to your question later on. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Sang Byung, for those public opinion data and also for zooming in on the military balance and how it is reflected in the political debate within the ROK. The U.S. Department of Defense is also conducting a nuclear posture review, as you know, and global posture review, where all these questions will be front and center. I'm sure we'll come back to all of this. Sang Byung already touched briefly on the younger generations, but I'm wondering if you could dwell a bit more on this point, on the point of how the younger generations of South Koreans perceive all these questions, not only the debate on inter-Korean relations and the nuclear debate, but also the broader process of Sino-American competition and Korea's place in that competition, South Korea's place in that competition specifically. And perhaps tell us a bit more about what impact you think that could have on ROK policy going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Simon, for those questions, and thank you to the conveners for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I'll continue on with what Ambassador Kim was telling us about the poll results. According to a survey by 중앙일보 on the question of Korean unification, 73% of those in their 40s responded that they support unification. But among those in their 20s, only 50% said they supported unification. So I'll share my thoughts on why I think this generation, we refer to it as the MZ generation, so the millennials and Generation Z, those born after 1980s, might have this decreased favorability towards the idea of unification. This MZ generation actually grew up witnessing dramatic changes in inter-Korean relations. Many of them were teenagers when the first historic inter-Korean summit occurred in 2000. And there was this society-wide expectation and excitement that perhaps inter-Korean relations would be different in our generation, in the MZ generation, than their previous generation. But within a few years, it became very clear that not only was this not the case, inter-Korean relations would dramatically worsen. The Korean society was shocked in 2008 when a South Korean tourist was shot at Kumgang Mountain by a North Korean soldier. And then in a couple of years, we of course saw the attack on the Yeonpyeong Island and the Cheonan. And you have to remember during this period, the millennials had many peers in the military at the time. So these instances were was an opportunity that made them become very clear-eyed about the kind of regime that's in North Korea. And at the same time, the MZ generation is entering the workforce. They're finding it difficulty to get permanent jobs. They're experiencing rising house prices, wealth gap. And there's a real frustration that maybe the South Korean government should be pouring more money into domestic, perhaps economic boost, rather than investing in projects intended for engagement with North Korea, especially if they're trying to hold a political event. For example, there was a lot of frustration in 2018 in the Pyeongchang Olympics when members of the South Korean ice hockey team were unable to compete because of the decision to have a joint team with North Korea. And I understand that some people would say that these cooperation efforts are necessary for the greater good of trying to push inter-Korean relations forward. But at the same time, it's these individual instances that make up the lived experience of the MZ generation that leads them to have these views on North Korea or views on South Korean policies towards North Korea. To talk a little bit about South Korea's position in US-China tensions, according to 3 different surveys, all had the results that the younger generation had a negative view of China, as Ambassador Kim mentioned. And I think it was last year's Pew Research Center survey of 14 different countries that all had unfavorable views of China. Interestingly, South Korea was the only country where the younger generation's view of China was actually more negative than the elder generation. And this indicates a real wariness of China's rise, as seen by the MZ generation in Korea. That this generation had front row seats to China's rise. They saw how that rise was soon accompanied by greater assertiveness in all respects. But the specific types of flashpoints between Korea and China were particularly damaging for Korea's perception of China. Of course, the controversy on hanbok, hanok, and kimchi. These are issues that hurt directly to the core of South Korea's culture and identity. And so these are really difficult to come back from. And this indicates why Korea's views of China was actually, I think in the 20-year age group, unfavorable views of China were 60%, followed by Japan at 20%, so a big gap there. And unfavorable views of North Korea came third with around 10%. And of course, we have other issues like China's initial handling of the pandemic and the protests, how it responded to the protests in Hong Kong. And this generation is incredibly tech-savvy. They see firsthand what's going on in other parts of the world through Instagram, Twitter. And so these individual instances also push the current generation farther and farther away from having favorable views of China. And as a sort of reaction to this, the more this continues, the more we can expect to see greater support for South Korea's increasing relations with the United States, increasing strengthening of the alliance. But there is some wariness there as well. We remember very clearly the difficulties of the negotiations for the Special Measures Agreement, President Trump's transactionalist approach to the alliance. And it's worrying that with one election that this could possibly happen again. So South Korea is in a predicament, and there are other risks of making this really explicitly clear. We don't want another THAAD incident, so there's always a fear of China's retaliation. But another kind of emerging worry is that the Biden administration or the US would encourage South Korea to work with other US allies, namely Japan, at a pace that's not quite comfortable with the Korean public. We can talk about ROK relations with Japan maybe a little bit later. And so pulling all these threads together, how the MZ generation would see South Korea's position in ROK US-China tensions, I would say they're a bit more calculating, a more willingness to see case-by-case basis rather than being grouped on ideology. And in terms of your question on the impact on ROK policy going forward, well, I would say that in the next 5 to 10 years, the current early millennials are now 40 years old. So I guess in the next 5 to 10 years, we can see more millennials assume positions of influence in Korean society. So we can expect to see a shift that reflects the preferences of the new generation. Thank you.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you very much for such a comprehensive and data-rich overview, Jaime. Let's now move on to our Korea shareholder. Ramon, it'd be great if you could provide us with a European perspective, of course. There's a lot of discussion about how the US, Chinese, Japanese, and even the Russian horse perceive the security situation in the peninsula, and because it affects them rather directly. But what is at stake for Europe from a security viewpoint, and what is the EU's view more specifically? And also, if I may, and I know that the ambassador also briefly touched on this, on the question of Sino-American competition, it seems that the EU is moving a bit closer to the US position on some questions, and we've seen the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council perhaps sort of pointing in that direction. In what ways are the EU's and ROK's perspectives on Sino-American competition similar, and in what ways do they differ? And last but not least, of course, what kind of role can the Europeans play when it comes to the security of the peninsula? Can we steer the cart, as the ambassador was hinting at?
Thank you, Luis, and thanks for the three presenters for really excellent presentations. And I'm going to start with the point that you make about the European perspective. This is, of course, my perspective, not the European perspective. I'll try to get a more European approach based on conversations, of course, with European policymakers, not only from the EU, from other countries, and also experts on East Asian security. I think the first question, what is at stake for the European Union? I mean, first of all, Korea is one of the strongest partners that the EU has at the global level, and certainly in East Asia. So if only from the perspective of supporting the policy of the South Korean government, which is to improve relations with North Korea, to bring peace to the peninsula, to achieve reconciliation, I think that's important from a European perspective, because the European Union will want support from Korea on other matters that are closer to Europe geographically. So I think that's important. But then if we focus on North Korea per se, obviously there are two threats coming from North Korea that are close to Europe. First of all, the non-proliferation regime. We all know that North Korea has been proliferating to different parts of the world, including to, of course, there are several countries in the Middle East and even North Africa. And this is a threat for the European Union in two ways. First of all, it is a threat to the non-proliferation regime per se, but also there is the possibility that some of this nuclear technology will steer an arms race in the region, or that it will fall on the wrong hands and it will pose a direct threat to European capitals. I mean, I've been part of discussions about this. What happens if we have a dirty bomb in a European capital with technology, nuclear technology that North Korea has proliferated, for example, to the Middle East? So that's something that we have to consider. And I think that North Korea is also a threat. We don't talk enough about it to human rights, right? To the global human rights regime. It's not certainly the only country in the region with a very poor human rights record, but it's a country that still has concentration camps, for example, right? So we're talking about extremely poor treatment of its own population. And we can have a lengthy discussion about how important values are on European foreign policy, the policy of the EU, member states, other European countries, but I think we can agree on something that actually Semi was touching upon, right? That the citizens of a country or European citizens the views to an extent should be reflected in foreign policy. Maybe they shouldn't guide foreign policy, but they should be reflected. So you could argue that the values that many Europeans or most Europeans actually share should be part of European foreign policy. And if you look at the strategy of the European Union, human rights is part of the strategy towards North Korea. And that takes me to the second point. What is the EU's position? I think the EU's position is that this can only be solved through negotiations, realistically, but that sanctions will remain in place until North Korea substantially changes its behavior. So we have a proper denuclearization process in which we can monitor that actually North Korea is moving away from possession of nuclear weapons. Whether we can achieve denuclearization or not is a different question. The official position is we can. I think if we ask privately, very few people would think that we can actually ever achieve denuclearization, but at the very least we should try. And we should be asking North Korea to take certain steps in that direction. And until that happens, I think the consensus among, if not all, most EU member states is that sanctions should still play a role in dealing with North Korea, but negotiations are important as well. And this is where the EU should play a role. We know that several EU member states are facilitators of dialogue. There's no secret about it. But as we have discussed in many different forums, I think that the days when the European Union would pay without saying, right, are gone, right? Now the European Union needs to be at the table. It won't be the core negotiator. We have the six main horses, as we mentioned before, right? But if we're going to discuss, for example, a comprehensive package, right, to steer North Korea in a different direction, the European would want to have a say about how to do this, right? Not necessarily being invited to contribute financially without having discussed, being part of the discussions about how to steer North Korea in a different direction. And related to this, the European would support a multilateral approach towards dealing with North Korea, as we have seen with Iran, for example, with the JCPOA. Now, the other question that you have is about the EU moving closer to the US position on US-China. In my view, something similar has happened in Korea. I think the mention about the statement between the President Moon and President Biden, many conservatives would argue that could be a conservative statement. It's not necessarily a liberal statement on the position that Korea put on China. The only thing missing from there was China, actually, right? We didn't mention China, but it was obviously very explicit. But even if you look at the G7 Open Societies statement, a very clear position from Korea on where it stands on this battle, so to speak, between the more open democratic societies and those that are more close. And the Open Societies statement was about Russia, but was also about China, without naming any of the two. You see Korea being critical of China on certain issues. For example, the Prime Minister gave an interview to Bloomberg about a month ago, I think it was, and he explicitly said that when it comes to semiconductors, when it comes to tech, he was openly critical of China in that interview. Is on YouTube for anyone to see. So you even have explicit criticism of China from the Prime Minister himself, right? Not the President, but the Prime Minister. So someone in a position of power in the government. And I think the direction of travel is clear. And I think there are two reasons for this. I mean, one of them has to do where Korea itself, right, the country itself, it doesn't have the same values as China, clearly, right? And more you see Korea openly talking about values in its foreign policy. I think this is very interesting. Obviously, it has been doing it for a while, but now it's openly talking about the importance of values. So it's very difficult, and other speakers have talked about this, for Korea to be close to this China, right? And this China behaving in this way. It would be easier the China of maybe the early 2000s when we thought it might open up, not becoming democratic, but maybe open up economically, but also socially. But we have seen a reversal there. And secondly, I think because the Biden administration has been very clever in its approach towards China. It has tried to gather together different allies, right, in minilaterals, in bilaterals. And this, I think this suits Korea very well. We all know they're about China, but they're not explicitly anti-China like we saw during the Trump administration. So that plays well with the current government in Korea, right? And the fact that now there is open discussion about should Korea be joining the Quad Plus? Has Korea de facto joined? Because many of the areas in which the Quad is working, Korea has an agreement with the US to work in exactly the same areas. If we look at the tech alliance that the US is putting together, you have Korea there, along with Taiwan, Japan, and obviously European countries as well. So you have these different platforms, and Korea joining them, and the competition is not military competition only, but obviously there are the components to the competition, such as tech, where Korea would play a role. But even if you look at the aircraft carrier that Korea is building, I mean, that's not for North Korea, right? There's another country next to North Korea, and this is the target, probably, right? Because South Korea, like many other countries, needs supports freedom of navigation, if only for its own self-interest, right? Because it's such a big trading nation. And this is a way to answer your question. I think that, do you see European countries, the EU, and Korea moving in the same direction? Dissatisfied with the Trump approach, but when it comes to the approach that the US is taking now, more willing to cooperate with the US. I guess the main dissimilarity, of course, is that was mentioned before by Ambassador Kim, that geography is essential here, right? China is going to be there, it has been there for millennia. Korea is going to be there, has been there for millennia. This is not going to disappear. In the case of Europe, we are on the other side of Eurasia, right? In the same platform, so to speak, geographical platform, but very far away from China. So I guess Korea has to be even more cautious than Europe can be. I'm not even going into the role of China in the North Korean issue, right? But even for geographical reasons, right? Korea has to be more cautious, at least in public.
Great. Thank you very much, Ramon, and to all of our three speakers for the excellent presentations. We're set to wrap up this session by 20 past noon, but we can go a little bit over time, given that we started late. So we're going to open the floor for any questions, comments you may have. Please raise your hands. I believe there are a few mics in the back, I am told. If not, I am sure you can make yourselves.
Yeah, we do have microphones.
We do have mics. So I've got one over there, two. I think that should be enough because we've got limited time. Please identify yourselves, name, affiliation, birthday, if you want.
Thank you. Anali from the European Commission. I have two questions to our former ambassador, Mr. Kim. But prior to that, I'd like to extend my deep gratitude for these excellent lectures to all the members of the panel. By considering all circumstances that we have discussed this far, especially the emerging concern, such as the rise of China as mentioned by Ms. Kim, or the ongoing complicated relations between US-China or even EU-China, I believe the South Korea's counter-move or the most impending work must be an endeavor to firmly set the so-called peace process or durable peace mentioned by Ambassador Mr. Kim in the Korean Peninsula. However, I personally see there exists two difficulties in realizing this. First of all, although there is no link with DPRK's nuclear issue, the fact itself that South Korea tries to strengthen its national defense capacity, particularly by undergoing the strategic partnership and the US-South Korea alliance, I think this is highly regarded as a threat in the eyes of North Korea. And in that respect, I'm grateful to learn your extended opinion how best South Korea can overcome such dilemma. And secondly, in a similar vein, if South Korea intends to strengthen its strategic partnership, deepen cooperation, collaboration with United States, how best South Korea can maintain or protect its domestic policy with enough room for the autonomy. Thank you.
All right, thanks. We've got a second question over there.
Thank you all the speakers. Oh, sorry. Thank you all the speakers of the panel for such a detailed overview of the topic. My question is to Ms. Kim. You mentioned the micro role of the youth in this very broad topic, and you mentioned the Olympics and the Korean hockey team in 2018 as a relevant example. As a political science student, in my head, all of these concepts of nationalism, a strong, separate, patriotic identity, they're usually related to the older generation because we normally expect millennials to be more open to the effects of globalization because they've experienced all that. So my question is, do you feel that this desire for individualism in the youth can be reconciled with the steps towards Korean reunification? And if yes, how? Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you both for the great questions. I've got a very question myself. We've talked a lot about the EU. As you know, we are in Brussels, and we have another big horse in town, which is NATO. NATO is set to adopt a strategic concept next year, and there is an intense discussion about China in the context of that debate, but also about NATO's partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, including with the ROK. So I was wondering, how is NATO perceived in Korea, and what do you expect from your partnership with NATO? You've got about 2.5 minutes each, and we'll follow the same order, and then we'll wrap it up, and I'll make some announcements regarding lunch, which you're all looking forward to.
So I go first?
Yeah. Please.
Thank you. First, on the question, security dilemma. Because as Ambassador Kim pointed out, the recent launch of hypersonic gliding vehicle is quite a significant development, which may impact our missile defense systems, not of the US, but of South Korea. So action-reaction chain is almost inevitable. But as you said, North Korea may claim it is a response to a test launch of our missiles we have done earlier. So we cannot get out of security dilemma, but to have a credible policy on North Korea, we have to make clear to North Korea, but also to our partners, that we have robust deterrence. And if deterrence fails, we have robust defense as well. So it is not easy to get out of the dilemma, but still we have to do it. But as you indicated, we have to make clear that we don't have any aggressive or starting any conflict or provocation from outside. So we have to make clear our intent to everybody, and we have to make it credible. Your second question about the alliance versus autonomy of South Korean policy. I mean, these two are the pillars of South Korean foreign policy, particularly after the Korean War, so over the last 7 decades. As Korea rises economically and also matures politically, our voice has grown from Peninsula focus to global focus. So one good example is what has happened after both Koreas joined the UN 30 years ago. I mean, South Korea's trajectory is like this, North Korea's trajectory like this. And that's why maybe North Korea never wanted to join the UN before 1991. But that contrast shows how South Korea can contribute, as also Ramon said, value-based, and also we have to make clear that we are status quo-oriented in our region. We don't seek to change the status quo. And I think that's the very important message we are sending out to North Korea, but also other partners as well. But with the rise of South Korea, the voice for autonomy in our foreign policy has also grown. But in certain issues, particularly related to hard security issues, still we depend on the alliance, particularly in response to North Korean nuclear and missile threat. We have no other choice but to rely on extended deterrence provided by the United States called the nuclear umbrella. So we are umbrella state. And that is a better option rather than South Korea trying to go nuclear. Maybe it is the second best for us, but still it is less bad option for our security. Back to your last question on NATO. Of course, the alliance system in our region, in East Asia, is different because it is 2 sets of different bilateral alliances. And weaker link is between Korea and Japan. So we cannot emulate what NATO is doing, but in responding to the threats outside of our region and outside of NATO region, like working together in Afghanistan and also in the coast of Somalia to counter piracy, are the good examples we can work together. And I hope that there will be a sort of growing room for the security understanding and also maybe the cooperative work done in a way to protect the interests of democratic and also free market economic principles we share with NATO. But again, as far as our security in our region is concerned, I think that will be quite a sensitive issue we have to reckon with, and I hope that will answer. So I don't think NATO can be thought of maybe being added as 8th horse. I have no problem with adding EU as a impartial, maybe honest broker, facilitator to steady the cart when we need EU's help, but maybe NATO is, I think, is outside of the scope. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very clear. Changbom.
Well, I think this Ambassador Kim has eloquently addressed those questions raised by a friend from EU Commission. So let me just jump on to the question related with NATO. Well, I've been serving as ambassador here in Brussels for 3 years, and I still recall some of the conversation that I have been sharing with my colleague ambassadors, NATO members from NATO member states. Korea is one of the global partners, together with Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So in the Asia-Pacific region, Korea is standing as a firm and close partner to work together with NATO. And I think that there are several specific areas that we could develop further collaboration with NATO. One is cybersecurity, which is increasingly and importantly important subject that we have to deal with. And another one is that counterterrorism. That is another issue that we have to deal with. And third one is we are already in operation with EU on anti-piracy of the coast of Somalia and Gulf of Eden. And I think there's, of course, there's, we haven't stretched out to the operational collaboration with NATO on the sea, but I think that's in due course. I think that's the one area that we could consider. And about the EU's possible or potential role to be played out vis-a-vis the Korean Peninsula, I think that's personally, I do believe that it's time for the European Union to have a critical look at critical engagement policy vis-a-vis North Korea that has been in place from, I think that's the year 1995. And of course, that's quite a long time ever since that EU has introduced a critical engagement vis-a-vis North Korea. I don't know whether that status is quite relevant, appropriate, and effective in resolving emerging challenges, especially proliferation concern on WMD and also cyber security and cyber attacks emanated from North Korea. So I think that's, this review process might be in need on the part of the EU because the paradigm has changed. North Korea's calculation has changed, capacities have increased, and then we are now in the middle of this US-China strategic competition, what we can do together. So that's something that I would like to toss up to you in Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So a critical look at critical engagement. That's a double negative. So perhaps we should just go back to engagement, which of course is much clearer. Simon, over to you.
Thank you for the question. So just to be clear, I don't think that the younger generation has absolute dislike of the idea of unification. It's more like a feeling of apathy. You know, they just want to get on with their lives. They don't want to be worried about nuclear or missiles on the Korean Peninsula. But their position is juxtaposed with the current mainstream, those in the mainstream who we refer to them now as the 586 generation. So this is those that were born in the 60s, went to university in the 80s, and are now in their like 50s or 60s, holding positions of power. And when there's a transition in generations in politics, these issues tend to rise to the surface and gain more attention, maybe. But in order for the younger generation to be more, to warm up to the idea of unification, I think there has to be a better communication of why unification is necessary. There's the time-old go-to argument that unification is the earnest desire of the Korean people, that the Korean Peninsula was divided against their will. These kind of arguments don't really resonate with the younger generation anymore. So there has to be more a critical and more objective, very long-term, clear, step-by-step idea or roadmap of unification, the idea of unification, in order for the younger generation to take the idea more seriously. Thank you.
Thanks. Ramon, you have the last word / words.
I don't think I had any specific questions, so just to double down on what Ambassador Kim said about the critical approach to critical review of critical engagement. We're pushing for it as scholars. We are not being listened, but we'll keep pushing for a critical reflection on critical engagement. And I'll leave it at that because I don't have any specific questions for myself. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we're kind of bang on time because we were 10 minutes late and now we're 10 minutes over time. Lunch will be served at the restaurant, so you get out, you make it right, and all the way until you hit some food. We'll be back here at 13:30 sharp, but before you rush out to get some food, please join me in thanking our fabulous speakers for a very interesting panel.